quiet start again this morning. 7 chapters into this book now, and this one turns inward in a way none of the previous 6 quite have. Away from external circumstances, external doubt, external trophies, and toward the actual mechanism sitting underneath all of it. The specific voice running inside a person's own head, moment to moment, deciding in real time what a given piece of difficulty actually means. The chapter is called The Most Powerful Weapon, and the weapon in question isn't a piece of equipment or a physical capability at all. It's the mind itself, specifically the internal dialogue that runs constantly, mostly unnoticed, narrating every hard moment as it happens. The book's argument is straightforward to state and genuinely difficult to actually practice. That internal voice isn't neutral background noise. It's either the single most useful tool a person has for getting through real difficulty, or, left unexamined and untrained, the single most effective thing working against them. And which one it actually is depends almost entirely on whether it's ever been consciously trained at all. I want to spend this whole episode on that internal voice specifically, because I think it's the most mechanically precise idea this book has offered so far. More so even than the tracking systems from a couple episodes back. Those were about managing external numbers. This is about managing the actual moment-to-moment narration a mind produces about its own experience, which turns out to be trainable in a much more specific way than most people, myself included for a long time, ever really examined. It's worth pausing on why this particular idea took 6 full chapters to actually arrive at, rather than opening the book. Everything covered so far, honest accounting, tested beliefs, tracked goals, structured suffering, built armor, has really been circling the same underlying territory, difficulty, and how a person relates to it. This chapter is where the book finally zooms all the way into the actual mechanism doing that relating moment by moment, which is really just a specific voice running constantly, mostly unexamined, deciding in real time what a given sensation is allowed to mean. Here's the core claim worth sitting with directly. The mind defaults to protecting comfort, and it does this primarily through narration, generating a running commentary that frames difficulty as unreasonable, unsustainable, or simply too much, well before any actual physical limit has been reached. That narration isn't a personal failing or a sign of weakness. It's closer to a built-in safety mechanism, cautious by design, erring heavily on the side of stopping too early rather than risking real damage. The problem isn't that this mechanism exists. The problem is treating its narration as an accurate, objective report on what's actually happening, rather than what it usually is, a conservative, protective story that reliably arrives well before the real ceiling does. It's worth being fair to that protective mechanism before moving past it, because it isn't simply a flaw to be eliminated. A mind with no protective caution at all would be genuinely dangerous, pushing through real injury signals just as readily as ordinary discomfort. The actual goal was never to silence that voice completely. It's to recalibrate it, to make its threshold for real alarm match actual physical evidence more closely than the overly cautious default it starts out with. This connects directly to something from a couple episodes back. The gap between where the mind first argues for surrender and where the body's real capacity actually ends. That earlier episode named the gap. This chapter is about the actual mechanism producing it, the specific narration running in real time, and more importantly, about the fact that this narration can be consciously noticed, interrupted, and replaced rather than simply endured as an unchangeable background condition. I want to walk through what this actually sounds like in practice, because train your self-talk is one of those pieces of advice that gets repeated often enough to become almost meaningless without a concrete example attached. The default narration on a genuinely hard morning tends to sound something like this almost verbatim across most people who've never consciously examined it. This is too much. I can't sustain this. Something's wrong. I need to stop. Every one of those statements sounds like an observation. Almost none of them actually are. They're predictions, dressed up as observations, generated by a protective system that's erring heavily toward caution rather than accuracy. Asterisk, asterisk. The trained version of this same moment sounds different, not because the difficulty itself has changed, but because the narration has been consciously redirected toward accuracy instead of automatic caution. Instead of, I can't sustain this, something closer to this is hard, and I've done harder. Instead of, something's wrong, something closer to this is what hard effort actually feels like, and I know the difference between this and a real injury signal because I've paid attention to that difference before. The facts of the moment haven't changed at all. What's changed is which narration gets to run the show, the automatic, protective one, or a consciously trained, more accurate one sitting right alongside it. Available the moment it's actually practiced enough to be ready. I had a specific morning that made this mechanism impossible to ignore once I actually noticed it happening in real time. About 4 miles into a genuinely difficult effort, the automatic narration arrived exactly on schedule. This is too much. You should slow down significantly. This doesn't feel sustainable. What made that particular morning different was catching the narration as narration, rather than experiencing it as simple fact, largely because of exactly the kind of test covered a couple episodes back for telling productive discomfort from real damage. The sensation itself matched the productive category clearly, hard, uncomfortable, consistent rather than sharply worsening. The narration was overriding that honest read with a more dramatic, more urgent story than the actual physical evidence supported. What struck me most about that morning, looking back, was how convincing the automatic narration actually was despite being wrong. It didn't feel like an exaggerated story easy to dismiss. It felt exactly like an accurate report, delivered with the same confidence a genuinely true observation would carry. That's really the whole difficulty this chapter is pointing at. The automatic narration doesn't announce itself as unreliable. It sounds exactly as credible as the truth. Once I actually noticed the gap between what the narration was claiming and what the physical evidence was actually showing, I could consciously insert a different sentence, not a denial of the difficulty, an accurate description of it. This is hard. It matches what hard effort is supposed to feel like, and I'm going to continue at this pace for another mile before reassessing. That sentence didn't make the discomfort disappear. It did something more useful. It gave the mind an accurate narration to run instead of the automatic catastrophizing one, and the difference in how the next mile actually felt was significant, not because anything physical had changed, but because the story running alongside the physical sensation had changed considerably. There's a piece of this worth naming carefully, because it's exactly the kind of idea that can tip into something unhelpful if it gets applied without real precision. Training accurate self-talk is not the same as forcing blind positivity or denying genuine difficulty. The trained narration in that example wasn't "this feels great" or "there's no problem here." It was an honest, accurate description of real difficulty, paired with a genuine, evidence-based assessment of whether it was safe to continue. Asterisk, asterisk toxic positivity, insisting everything's fine regardless of actual evidence, is just a different flavor of inaccurate narration, no more useful than the catastrophizing version, just wrong in the opposite direction. The goal was never to make the internal voice relentlessly cheerful. It was to make it accurate, which sometimes means acknowledging real difficulty honestly, and sometimes means refusing to let that honest acknowledgement get inflated into something larger and more alarming than the actual evidence supports. I want to be direct about why this particular boundary matters more here than it might in some general discussion of positive thinking, given who this channel has always been built for. Someone carrying real injuries, someone whose body genuinely does have limits worth respecting, is in real danger from the toxic positivity version of this practice, specifically the version that insists on staying upbeat regardless of what the body is actually reporting. The accurate version of this technique has to be willing to produce an honest sentence like, "This is worse than usual," and the plan is to stop exactly as readily as it produces "this matches hard effort." and the plan is to continue. A trained voice that's only ever capable of generating the second kind of sentence isn't trained. It's just a more sophisticated version of the same denial this whole series has warned against since a couple episodes into the first book. I want to be specific about the mechanism that makes this training actually work over time, because understanding it changes how the whole practice gets approached. Every time the accurate narration successfully gets substituted for the automatic one, in a real moment of difficulty, that substitution gets slightly easier to make the next time. It's not a one-time realization that permanently rewires anything. It's a skill built the same way any other skill gets built, through repeated, deliberate practice under conditions that actually matter. The first several times, I consciously interrupted the automatic narration. It required real, effortful attention, noticing the catastrophizing sentence, actively constructing a more accurate one, holding on to that accurate version deliberately against the pull of the automatic one. Over months, that process has gotten noticeably faster and less effortful. Not because the automatic narration stopped showing up, it still shows up almost every horror morning, but because the trained response has become considerably more available, closer to automatic itself now than it was at the start. This is worth connecting explicitly to the callus metaphor from a couple episodes back, because I think it's the clearest way to understand why repeated practice actually changes the difficulty of the substitution over time, rather than staying equally hard every single time it gets attempted. A callus doesn't form because the friction itself stops hurting. It forms because repeated exposure changes the underlying tissue's response to that same friction. The trained narration works through a nearly identical mechanism, not because hard effort stopped producing an automatic catastrophizing voice, but because repeated, successful substitution changes how quickly and how easily the accurate version can actually be accessed the next time it's needed. This connects to the callus idea from a couple episodes back in a way worth naming directly, because I think this chapter is really describing a specific, more precise version of exactly the same underlying mechanism. The armor built through repeated, controlled exposure to discomfort wasn't just physical toughness in some vague sense. A significant part of it was exactly this, a trained internal narration, built through repetition, that meets difficulty with accuracy rather than automatic catastrophizing. The callus and the trained voice aren't two separate ideas sitting next to each other in this book. They're the same underlying adaptation, described once through a physical metaphor and once through the actual mechanism producing the psychological side of that adaptation. I want to walk through a specific technique for actually practicing this, because the idea alone, notice the automatic narration and replace it with something accurate, stays abstract without a concrete method attached to it. The technique that's worked best for me has 3 steps, done in the moment, on a hard mile, when the automatic narration first shows up. First, name it explicitly, even just internally. That's the automatic voice talking. Second, check it against the actual physical evidence, using the same productive versus damaging test from a couple episodes back. Third, construct one specific, accurate sentence to replace it. Not a vague positive affirmation, a specific evidence-based statement about what's actually happening and what the plan actually is, ***. I want to walk through why each of those 3 steps matter specifically, rather than just listing them, because skipping any one of them tends to weaken the whole practice considerably. The first step, simply naming the automatic voice as automatic, does something surprisingly powerful on its own, even before the other 2 steps happen. The moment a thought gets identified as the automatic protective narration, rather than simply accepted as what's true, it loses a significant amount of its automatic authority. It becomes something to evaluate rather than something to simply obey. ***, that single shift, treating a thought as a claim to be checked rather than a fact already established, is doing a large part of the actual work, even before any replacement sentence gets constructed at all. The second step, checking the claim against actual physical evidence, is what keeps this whole practice honest rather than turning into exactly the toxic positivity I've already warned against. This is where the earlier test, sensation staying consistent versus sensation sharply worsening, actually gets used in real time, not just as an abstract diagnostic tool, but as a specific evidence that either confirms or contradicts what the automatic narration just claimed. Skipping this step and going straight to constructing a positive replacement sentence is exactly how this practice turns into denial rather than accuracy. And it's the step I'd guess is most commonly skipped by anyone trying this technique for the first time, because it requires an honest pause the other two steps don't quite demand in the same way. I want to be honest about how tempting it is to skip that second step. Naming the automatic voice feels almost effortless once practiced, and constructing a confident replacement sentence feels satisfying, almost immediately rewarding. Actually stopping to check the physical evidence honestly in the middle of real discomfort requires a kind of patience the other two steps don't ask for, which is exactly why it's the step most likely to get rushed under real pressure. The third step, constructing a specific replacement sentence rather than a vague one, matters more than it might initially seem. A vague replacement, something like "you've got this" or "stay strong," doesn't actually compete well against a specific, detailed, catastrophizing narration, because vague statements are inherently weaker than specific ones in exactly this kind of internal argument. A specific, accurate sentence, "this matches hard effort, I'll reassess in 1 mile," tends to hold up against the automatic narration in a way a generic motivational phrase simply doesn't, because it's actually engaging with the same level of detail the automatic voice was using rather than trying to overpower it with volume or enthusiasm alone. I noticed this the first few times I tried using vague, generic encouragement instead. You can do this produced almost no effect against a specific, detailed, catastrophizing thought, like "this pace is unsustainable and your legs are about to give out." The generic phrase wasn't engaging with the actual content of the automatic claim, which meant the narration simply continued running underneath it, largely unaffected. A specific counterclaim forced a real comparison between two equally specific accounts of what was happening, and specificity is what lets the accurate version actually win that comparison. There's a boundary worth naming clearly here, because this entire practice depends on the second step actually being done honestly rather than skipped in a rush to feel better. If the physical evidence, checked honestly, actually does support the automatic narration, if the sensation really is sharply worsening rather than staying consistent, the accurate replacement sentence has to reflect that too, which means stopping rather than continuing. This technique isn't a tool for pushing through everything regardless of what's actually happening. It's a tool for making sure the decision to continue or stop is actually being made based on real evidence, rather than being made by default by whichever narration happens to be loudest in a given moment, whether that's automatic catastrophizing or an equally inaccurate wave of forced enthusiasm. I want to bring this back to something covered a couple episodes ago, because I think it clarifies exactly where this technique fits into everything this channel has built up so far. The withheld marker test asked whether a goal's value survived the removal of external recognition. This technique is doing something adjacent but different, asking whether a given moment's difficulty narration survives contact with actual physical evidence. Both are, underneath their different applications, the same basic move this whole series keeps returning to, checking a claim against reality rather than simply accepting it because it arrived first or loudest. So here's what this looks like as a practice, kept to one thing rather than scattered across several. The way this channel has approached every idea across both books so far. On your next genuinely hard run, when the automatic narration shows up, and it will practice the 3 steps directly in order. Name it. That's the automatic voice. Check it. Does the actual physical evidence, sensation staying consistent versus sharply worsening, actually support what it just claimed? Replace it. Construct one specific, accurate sentence about what's actually happening and what the plan actually is, not a vague affirmation, a specific evidence-based statement. I want to add one habit that's made this stick considerably better than treating it as a single technique to remember and apply from scratch every time. After the run, while it's still fresh, write down whatever the automatic narration actually said that day, in its own words, and whatever the accurate replacement ended up being. Over several weeks, that record starts revealing something useful on its own. The automatic narration tends to repeat a fairly small number of specific phrases over and over, which means the accurate replacements can eventually get prepared in advance, rehearsed before the difficulty even arrives, rather than constructed fresh under pressure every single time. I've been keeping this kind of record for about 6 weeks, and the pattern surprised me. There were really only 4 or 5 distinct catastrophizing sentences the automatic voice reached for, recycled across dozens of hard mornings. Once that became visible, preparing accurate counters in advance, calmly, at a desk rather than mid-run, made the technique considerably faster to deploy. The automatic voice is far less creative than it feels while it's running. I want to add one more layer of practical guidance, aimed at how to handle a morning where the checking step genuinely produces an ambiguous result, neither clearly safe nor clearly a warning sign. On those mornings, the accurate replacement sentence should reflect that ambiguity honestly rather than defaulting to either extreme. Something closer to, this is uncertain enough that the plan is to slow down and reassess within a few minutes, rather than forcing a confident verdict the evidence doesn't yet support. Tomorrow morning, whatever the automatic voice says the moment things get hard, and it will say something the same way it always has, isn't actually reporting a fact about the world. It's offering a claim generated by a cautious, protective system that would rather stop too early 100 times than risk real damage once. That claim deserves to be checked, not simply obeyed, and the specific, accurate sentence available to replace it, once it's actually been practiced enough times to be ready, might turn out to be the most powerful tool available on any given hard morning, exactly the way this chapter's title insists it is. I think this chapter earns that title more than it might seem to on first read. Every other tool covered across this whole series, tracked numbers, structured plans, deliberate discomfort, has ultimately had to pass through this same mechanism to actually matter. A perfectly tracked goal still needs an accurate internal narration to survive a hard week. This chapter isn't offering one tool among many. It's naming the mechanism every other tool in this book has secretly depended on the whole time. I'll see you on the trail tomorrow. Same time, same choice, and whatever the voice says about it, checked honestly before it gets believed. This is Run to Evolve. One day, one run, one lesson, no excuses.